And yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and start diving in. Are we good to go?
Yep, we are good. The recording is just starting.
Fabulous. Well, as Jackson kind of mentioned, yeah, I'm here because I'm a fruit tree dork and just love nothing more than the incredible feeling of being able to stand under a fruit tree and harvest bounty that just seems to bring so much excitement in my life. And it's kind of with that in mind that I operate custom foodscaping. Our tagline is "Have your landscape and eat it too." And we design and install food producing landscapes. So we work with institutions and homeowners to build raised bed gardens, not that different than the kind that Gateway Greening does for public entities, as well as plant edible landscapes, which consist of things like mixtures of fruit trees and perennial herbs, perennial vegetables, flowers. So that's kind of what we do. And then the really fun stuff is getting to talk about it. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about tonight. I will give the caveat here that this is a topic that I would not consider a very beginner topic when it comes to gardening and fruit trees. So inherently, I think there is quite a bit of complexity here, and I've done my very best to break it down into simple terms, but I'm very much expecting a number of questions at the end of the presentation, and so I will look forward to those, and hopefully we'll get a lot of good questions there. Let's see. So I want to start off with this amazing image. It is actually a mock-up of a particular tree that is already in existence. And maybe some of you have seen this. I know that I saw this come across my social media feed, and it was kind of this incredible fruit tree that there was this photo, and then there was this title, and it said 40 different fruit trees growing on one tree, 40 different varieties of fruit growing on one tree. And a lot of people were into it, and I know that I was one of those people. And this particular fruit tree has peaches, it's got plums, it's got apricots, cherries, nectarines, and almonds, the forgotten stone fruit nut, which looks remarkably like a peach. So the thing that makes this all possible is this incredible act of grafting, the ability to take all different kinds of fruit tree varieties and put them together on one single tree, or in the case of what we're going to mostly be talking about, just putting one variety on a tree. This is kind of the ultimate of what you could do with grafting. And so I'll kind of start us there, and then we'll break this down into simpler and simpler terms so that we can start to understand, well, how would we even begin to create a tree like this? And I should say, by the way, for those of you who haven't grown many, this visual that we're seeing right now is a representation of the flowering stage. Of course, we're not seeing a lot of fruits, but stone fruits are known to have gorgeous pink and white and purple blooms, and this is kind of what something like that would look like. Okay, so tonight we're going to look at a lot of images like this of what grafting is, and I'm going to kind of get into the details of that later, but at its most basic level, we're going to start at the photo on the left. It's the idea of taking a cutting, which is a snip off of a tree, an existing plant, and connecting it to a different plant. So as we can see in the right-hand picture, we've got an existing branch on the right, and then we're sticking those cuttings that we've just taken from the left into the existing tree. And our goal there is that the two pieces of wood are going to fuse together and become one. So that is really what grafting is at its most basic level. Okay. And so what we're really talking about is, I'm actually going to skip, is cloning. All right. So these are a picture of two tiny little puppies that were cloned. Forget the exact story, but I think we all understand the idea of cloning. It's identical genetics. And what that really means when it comes to grafting, we call this asexual propagation, where we're actually taking the genetics of one fruit tree and we are moving those clones, each one of those cuttings from the tree that we saw before, each one of those cuttings is a clone of wherever it goes from the original. So let's take the Fuji apple tree, for example, because I know that when I was a kid going to the grocery store, the Fuji apple was like my favorite fruit. And And so what this means is that if we look at the tree on the right, let's imagine that is the original Fuji apple tree. And of all the varieties that exist in the world, every single fruit, pretty much every fruit that comes from a tree that you see at the grocery store came from one original parent tree. And it's from that tree on the right, the original Fuji apple, that cuttings were taken and they were grafted or fused onto other apple branches. And then as those became bigger and bigger, those trees, then there were more and more available Fuji apple cuttings. And as those amplified in quantity, we were able to bring the Fuji apple, for example, into production, meaning there were so many cuttings available that farmers could actually start create grafting Fuji apples in their orchards or buy grafted Fuji apples. And so what that means is every Fuji apple that we see is genetically identical. It's a clone, just like these two little baby puppy clones. So what is grafting? I can't actually see all the words on my screen with Zoom blocking it. So I'm not sure what that sentence says actually, but let's look at some more. Let's further flesh this out of what grafting actually is and what it looks like. So we can see a picture here. Let's look at the bottom picture. We've got a beautiful peach tree, right? And let's say that we've got the most beautiful peaches on this tree, and we feel like we really want to make sure that our neighbor gets the same peach tree that we have. And let's imagine that that tree on the right side of the screen, let's imagine that was a peach pit that your neighbor threw out when they were playing in the yard. And then all of a sudden, a little baby peach started to come up. Well, that peach pit is of unknown genetics. We don't know anything about it. It came from the grocery store and we don't know what variety it is. We don't know anything about how that peach tree is going to perform. But what we can do is take a snip off of this amazing peach tree that we have in our yard and create a clone. So that means that if we create that clone, we've got the exact same genetics as on our tree. Now we can move that around to our neighbor's tree. And what that looks like in the case of the picture here is called a bud. So this is not a big piece of wood. This is literally a tiny bud that was taken off of your beautiful peach there at the bottom of the screen. And then a piece of that wood was moved onto that baby sapling that we see on the right. And once effectively moved, then what we've got is a grafted tree that is going to ultimately produce the same peaches that we have in our yard. So that's kind of grafting at its most basic level. And the thing that makes it all work is this idea of the cambium tissue in what we call the inner layer underneath the bark of any branch of wood, right? We know that we've kind of got this green layer that surrounds the heartwood inside the hardwood. It's that wood inside that is pretty inactive. Okay, not a lot of cell division happening there. The vast majority of the biological activity happening in a branch of wood is that green ring right underneath the bark of the tree. And that green ring we call the cambium, and it's in around that area where the xylem and phloem are. If we think about what is transporting water and nutrients through the tree and all that good important stuff, and it's where all that new cell activity is happening. And so what we need to do is take what we see at the top of the screen, we call that the bud from the previous. See that tiny bud that the arrow is pointing to? This is it super enlarged at the top. And then we need to take that bud and match that green cambium tissue up with the green cambium tissue of the fruit of the branch that we're hoping to put it on. So once we do that, we give ourselves a chance to have a graft take, we call. So we might, if we do a graft, we might say, did it take? And if it took, that means they were successful in fusing together. And now what was a previous tree has a new set of genetics on it. And so if you're feeling like, this isn't solidifying for me yet, then hang tight. This is a very hard concept, I feel, to convey without some good visuals. So what I've done is I've queued up a video that is going to be a few minutes long, and we'll play that video and then we'll keep on moving on. Jackson, will you remind me what I need to click to get the audio? How did that feel? Hopefully that illustrated a little bit what we're getting at, that little video. That's one of my favorite videos that I remember when that came out. It was just felt crystal clear what we're going for with some of this grafting work. And if you're kind of sitting there scratching your head and you thought, oh, I thought grafting was another thing, you're probably right. There are many ways to do grafting, and this is just one way. And I'm focusing on this form of grafting for this presentation because I personally think it's the easiest and most accessible. Unfortunately, I think the most common forms of grafting are unfortunately the most challenging. And but we'll look at those other forms of grafting in a little bit. So we took a pause for station identification. That was the video there. All right. So let's put some relevance behind what grafting is even all about and why it even matters. And to do that, I want to tell a story that maybe some of you know. It's the story of the European vineyard blight. So back in the 1800s, there was a blight going around in Europe. And I guess specifically in France, where the grapevines were all being plagued by a blight that was killing them. And so something needed to be done, and I think the French teamed up with an American, a breeder named T.B. Munson. And Munson was this incredibly prolific grape expert in the U.S. and did amazing things to preserve the grape diversity of this country. Basically, what happened was the grapes of the US, some of the varieties, or I think it was a specific variety, was sent to France, and that was then planted instead of the varieties that were all growing in the French vineyards. And the cool thing about this was that the variety, the American variety that was sent over and planted, was resistant to the blight that was currently that was plaguing the French at the time. And then once the trunk of the grapevine grew up, then they were able to graft their beloved varieties onto the American rootstock, the part that had been initially planted in the ground, and thus the French wine industry was saved. So for those of you who might be sitting around with a glass of wine, you might have Munson to thank, because the French vineyards might have gone under a long time ago. Who knows where wine would be these days? So it kind of starts to illuminate a little bit of why grafting even matters. But let's look at some other reasons why grafting matters. So grafting matters because, like I said, right, we've got clones that we're taking. Okay. And when we're taking a clone of something, that means we know how it's going to perform, right? If you've watched a plant grow for a long time, right, then you have a pretty decent idea of how it is going to handle disease, how big its fruit's going to be, what it's going to taste like, what time of year it's going to bloom, right? We can all of a sudden make all these observations and predictions and start to understand many of its characteristics, which allowed for us to really hedge our bets and basically start the commercial growing that we know today. Because if you are trying to grow apples and you have no idea what size fruits you're going to get, if the blooms are all going to get frozen off every spring, if it tastes like junk, well, that's a huge risk if you're going to plant out a bunch of apples like that. So what would be way less risky would be to know, oh, I've got this genetic clone. It makes huge fruits. It's got awesome disease resistance, tastes amazing, blooms late, and I want it to bloom late. So I can select for all these different traits and continue to perpetuate those good genetics that I want. And so through grafting, we're able to have consistency. I mean, these are just four of the reasons. There's dozens we could go on and on to. Let's just take the Fuji example for one example. If we only planted the seeds of the original Fuji apple, we'd have this incredible genetic diversity that wouldn't give us very much at all in terms of predictability. And of course, it's the predictability that we as consumers and that farmers rely on, right? We want to know that every time we go select the Fuji apple at the grocery store, we're going to have an idea of what it's going to taste like. And the farmer wants to know all these different things so that they can market it and sell it correctly. So the important reasons why we even think about grafting. All right. But let's look at this question of, well, where the heck did these fruit trees even come from? Where do these varieties even come from? And, because how did that Fuji apple become the Fuji apple, right? I mean, what's the story there, right? And the story is that, let's start on the right-hand side of the screen. Every plant that we see in the grocery store, right, started as some wild, uncultivated plant somewhere in the world. And at some point, people stumbled upon this plant in the wild and they decided, you know what? I like this one. I'm going to eat this one. It's delicious and it's nourishing and it seems to be growing everywhere where I live. So I'm going to start growing this one. All right. And in this case, let's pretend we're talking about blackberries because that's what we see on the right-hand side of the screen. So you're walking around and you've been eating blackberries, since the day you were born. And this one day you're out and about and you come across these gigantic blackberries. Now, these blackberries are totally unlike any of the other blackberries that you've ever seen. They're twice the size, in fact, and the bush is twice as bountiful. And you're thinking to yourself, my goodness, I wish all the blackberries were this abundant. I wish the fruits were all this big. And so what's going on here? Well, what's going on is that in the wild, right, there is all this genetic variability. And sometimes we have mutations. Sometimes we just have different things going on that in this case might cause increased fruit size, increased sweetness, increased production. And if you're somebody who's getting food from the wild, then you're sure as heck going to be like, well, I want more of this. And what you might do is you might dig up that bush and take a division from it, making a clone or taking a cutting, and you might root that cutting and plant it closer to where you live so that all of a sudden now all the big delicious blackberries that you found way out and about, now they're all growing way closer to your house. And if your name is Jimmy, then you might call that variety that you just dug up Jimmy. So now we've got the Jimmy blackberry, and you might start to show that blackberry to friends, and of course they're going to come around and be like, well, I want some of that Jimmy blackberry. And then eventually um, that blackberry is going to get so desired that you might just start getting tons and tons of cuttings and selling it under the name the Jimmy blackberry. And that is how something becomes a variety. So that's one way. That's from the wild, right? Another way that's common would be through breeding work. This could be backyard breeders. This could be university breeders. We'll look at our friends, the elderberry growers who are in central Missouri here on the left, where University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry and other folks in central Missouri are working on breeding elderberries. Now, what that means is that they're creating an increased pool of genetic diversity. So what they're doing is they might take an acre, right? Take an acre plot, think of a football field, right? And you go around and you collect 100 different elderberry cuttings from all different parts of Missouri, and then you bring them into that acre field. And every time they flower, you create crosses or hybrids. Now, the elderberries, they are readily hybridizing in the wild anyway. But what breeding does is it increases the number of crosses or the number of hybrids that you might produce in a single area, in a single observable area. That way you can stroll through and see, well, dang, because of all these crosses I made, I've got 15,000 unique new sets of elderberry genetics with this next generation. And then you can evaluate, well, which one of these meet my criteria? And my criteria we already talked about with the blackberries. We're talking about things like, we want sweet fruits, big fruits, heavy production, late flowering. So once you find some of those, then you're gonna say, you know what? These are the big winners. I'm gonna call this one York, Adams, and Bob Gordon. And those became the 3 elderberry varieties that you stick with and start breeding. So that's where these varieties come from, right? And it's no different from the apple. The apple started out as a wild plant, just like the blackberries you may know from the woods, and the apples from the Kazakhstan part of the world. And wild apples became bigger and sweeter and more desirable for our consumption, so that we didn't have to do as much work for an increased yield. All right. So let's jump to another part of this whole equation with fruit trees, and then I'm going to tie this a little bit together in the next slide. Many of you who've bought fruit trees or heard about fruit trees, you've probably heard about this idea of dwarf, semi-dwarf, and standard. You might be asking yourself, does that have anything to do with what we're talking about here? And what those all refer to is rootstock. Now, you may have heard in the video that we watched, the gentleman speaking referred to the rootstock. Now, the rootstock is the part with its roots in the ground. All right. So take a plant, right? Stick it in the ground and it's going to start rooting out. And just like that little whip or that sapling that we saw in the video, it might just be 2 feet tall, right? And then that rootstock, okay, it has its own specific genetics, okay? In the case of apples, we are cloning rootstocks. What does that mean again? It means that we know what genetics each rootstock is going to impart onto the tree ultimately. So some rootstocks, like a bud 9 apple, for example, that would be a dwarfing rootstock. And no matter what variety of apple we graft on to that bud 9, it's going to be a dwarf. Why? Because it's a genetic dwarf. And for whatever reason, that apple was kind of a stunted, weak apple that when it was growing in the wild, for example, it just didn't grow very tall. And it was and it got probably knocked over easily in the wind, and it couldn't really stand up for itself very amongst the elements. And so it was kind of a weakling. And that's why it became a dwarf. And then you've got semi-dwarfs, which are other rootstocks. You might have like an MM111, which is another named type of apple rootstock. Now, the rootstock names are way less sexy than the names we're used to seeing in the grocery store. And then you've got other varieties, something that are like standard. These are big trees. And the reason they're big trees is because the rootstock imparts that vigor or that size onto the tree. So you could have a 10-foot Fuji tree, a 15-foot Fuji tree, or an 18-foot Fuji tree. You can take the same cutting from the same Fuji tree and graft it on, but the thing that's different that imparts size more than anything is the rootstock, right? So let's look at that in a diagram. Okay, so we see the picture on the left, right? Let's look closely at the picture on the left. The part of this diagram where the roots are growing below the soil, we call that the rootstock. And then you can see, look at midway through the image and where it says graft union. You can ignore the interstock or interstem. That graft union is where the two pieces of genetics came together. So the top, what we see referred to as the scion, well, in this case, the scion is that Fuji apple, right? And the real illustration of this can be seen on the right, all right? So you can see that arrow. The top part is the scion wood, and the scion wood is the cultivar name, all right? So if we have a cultivar, we might call it Gala, we might call it Fuji or Liberty or Arkansas Black. All these are different fruit tree varieties. And those are all scion wood. Those are all the types of genetics that we would want to take cuttings of. And that cutting that we took, that is called a piece of scion wood. All right. And then that piece of wood below is the rootstock. And that has, as you can see in the picture there, it determines size of a tree, but it also determines other things like, you know, there's different disease resistances among different rootstocks. We learned about that with the grape example. For example, the American rootstock for the grape was not susceptible to the blight that was moving through France. Therefore, it was able to withstand it, and they were able to graft the French varieties on top of it. So let me pause here for a minute and see if this makes sense. Jackson, you can holler at me if there's anybody asking questions, but I feel like this is essential to understanding before we go any further. Do we feel like we're clear on this and we're good to go forward?
We haven't gotten any Q&A. We did have somebody ask during the video when he was flicking out that wood.
Yep.
Was he talking, does he mean heartwood? That's the phrasing.
Yes.
Of the question. Okay.
Yeah. And the reason he flicked out that wood is because basically it doesn't contain any of the genetic material around that wood is the cambium, that green tissue, which is where all the magic's happening.
Gotcha. Yeah, we don't have any other Q&A right now, so I'd say keep going.
Great. Let's keep rocking. Okay, so let's walk through the seasons here, because you got to understand the thing about grafting. First, you got to know how to do it, but then you got to know when to do it, right? So let's walk through the year here. So we're in winter right now. So let's start up there. All right. As we already talked about, what you got to do is you got to take cuttings. Now, most commonly fruit tree grafting, the cuttings are taken in the winter, this time of year, in fact. And then when you take those cuttings, as was mentioned by the guy in the video, you take a cutting and you got to know what variety it was. And let's pretend it's the Fuji. And then you take all those cuttings and you bundle them together. And these are called bud sticks, right? And then those bud sticks go in the fridge in a plastic bag. You keep them till the spring. Then in the spring, you're going to do exactly what the video showed us. You're going to take a bud off of your bud stick. Each bud is graftable, or you can take a little stick and graft it, as we'll look at in a second, and you graft it onto the rootstock. All right. Then in the summer, of course, you're going to relax a little bit, get some hammock time, right? You also have a chance to do some summer grafting. Now this is a unique thing, mostly that I'm with apples and pears, where you can actually, you notice that top picture in the middle, there's leaves on the tree. This is what was happening in the video that we saw, actually. That was summer grafting, where fresh growth was taken off of an apple tree, and then the leaves were cut off, and then you just had a fresh green bud stick. And then you can see, I love that top right-hand picture. You can see that basically what was done, just jumping around, is a slit was made in the rootstock, and that scion wood, that piece of variety, was stuck into the rootstock and thus fused together, right? So then in the fall, you've got two options. Then you can see, or in the picture of the fall, is we're pruning the growth around our newly grafted tree, because, well, if you put a graft onto a rootstock, the rootstock is still going to try to make branches. So what you need to do is make sure that once your graft takes and they're fused together, that becomes the only genetics that get to continue to grow up and express themselves in the tree, because your rootstock is going to make tiny, not delicious, unmarketable apples. So what you want to make sure is that the only genetics that get to continue upward are those Fuji apple genetics. And then later in the fall, you can potentially dig out your grafted tree and move it once it's gone dormant. Usually that's late November, early December, before the ground freezes. You can dig up the fruit tree that you've grafted and move it to its final location.
So,
okay,
Matt, what's the earliest month that you can start grafting in?
Generally, if you don't have a greenhouse, April in our climate. But lots of like commercial growers will be able to do it way earlier, because they've got a heated space. You've got this tender little bud, right? It's tiny, and it is at risk of being frozen off, and and that will happen if it isn't, respected until spring weather starts.
Gotcha. Yep. And is there we're getting a couple questions, any long-term weakness in the tree at the area of the graft? And then somebody is asking where we are. We're in St. Louis, Missouri also. We do have people from kind of all over the US.
Yeah, we're
but yeah,
I'm sorry,
weakness in the area of the tree, Matt.
There is weakness in terms of, there is susceptibility for the graft breaking off. That happens all the time. So you got to be really careful to not rub up against your newly grafted tree. Yep.
Great.
Okay. So now we've seen this magical thing called grafting. We got a basic idea of what it's all about. How can you all get started with this year? Well, the cool thing is it's the prime time to go prune your fruit trees, right? So when you prune your fruit trees, what you're going to do is you're going to take the new young growth at the ends of the tree, which was last year's growth, and we call that the scion wood or the bud sticks. And that is what you're going to go collect now, or get from a friend's tree, or order it online. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then you're going to store that in the fridge till spring. You are also going to order rootstock at this point. Where do you get that rootstock that we talked about? Well, you got to order it for the most part from a supplier of rootstock, the same kind of places that sell fruit trees. Okay. And then you could also do a whip and tongue kind of dormant graft at this point of the year. And we'll look at what that looks like. But basically, I'm not going to get into that too much today, because I think it's more advanced, and I want you all to just have the easy option for doing this. So then in spring, you're going to get your rootstock shipped to you. You're going to plant your rootstock, and then you're going to graft those trees that you saved your budwood from this winter. Okay. It's also at that time that you can be guerrilla grafting Bradford pears. And we're going to look at that in a future slide. Then during the summer, more grafting opportunities, things like mulberries and pawpaws and persimmons. You have the opportunity of taking that budwood that you saved over the winter and grafting those varieties in the summer. Okay. Finally, in the fall, we talked about you're going to, prune your grafts, make sure that the ones that you like are having a chance to flourish and that you're not letting the rootstock outcompete the trees that you've just grafted. So there are some other types of graft. What we saw in a video was the idea of a bud graft, but there's some other kinds of grafts that are really cool. I think the coolest one is the one in the top right, which I believe is called a cleft graft. And that's where you take a little cutting. In this case, the cutting is like 3-4 inches long. It's got a few buds on it. And you make this angled cut, almost like making it into an arrow. Okay. And then you just stick your knife in the top of your rootstock and make a slit. Now, when you make that slit, you're going to see green cambium tissue all the way around the edges. And so what you're going for is taking a piece of scion wood that has about the same diameter as your rootstock. So that's where you're going to clip your rootstock, is where the diameter of your scion wood is about the same. So we can see that in these pictures here, and then they end up coming together. What you don't see in these pictures is that, just like we saw in the video, you would use that grafting tape to wrap it up. And what that does is it secures it and it keeps the moisture in. So you can see some other types of grafts. This is really cool. These are even more advanced techniques. This is called top working. And this is where we take entire established trees and we lop off all the branches and we graft new varieties onto all the stubs, which is, an amazing idea. If let's say that you've got a Fuji apple and then you realize, well, dang it, why did I plant this Fuji apple? It's ridden with pest and disease issues. I wish I would have planted that Liberty apple that doesn't have any problems. Well, then you can cut down your Fuji apple, not all the way down, leave those branches there, those main branches, and then get some cuttings from your friend who's got that Liberty apple and graft those on. Okay, so then I mentioned this, and this is maybe the most readily accessible way of grafting that we'll go over tonight, and it's called guerrilla grafting. And many of you know about the Bradford pear. Bradford pear was a very commonly planted landscape plant several decades ago, and it turned out to be terribly invasive. It's an exotic, meaning a non-native, and it's been carried around by birds and spread into places that a lot of us would prefer they aren't growing. So the cool thing about this is it's actually a huge opportunity. And because and the reason for this is that Bradford pear is the same genetics as as our Asian and European pears that we're used to eating. So what we can start doing, what I would encourage us to start doing, is guerrilla grafting these Bradford pears and taking something that is very vigorous and productive. It produces all these tiny little pears that we can't eat. How about we start collecting? I have found Asian pears specifically to be incredibly straightforward and easier to graft in comparison to European pears. And this is how huge the opportunity is. Maybe the most easy to graft and easy to grow of the kind of more common fruits is the pear. And it just so happens that there's pears growing all around us in the city and the suburbs. I find them everywhere. So once we got the opportunity to get some scion wood, then we can go to existing pear trees, existing Bradford pears, and graft it on. And then our walk down the street will be full of bounty and delicious pears. Okay. So another concept here that I want to jump to that is kind of with us winding down here. We've got a few more slides and then we'll be able to jump to questions. is the idea of using our grafting technology to pretty please, um, encourage nurseries and to look for, if you are a consumer here, multi-grafted cocktail trees. Now, we talked about that tree in the bottom right at the beginning of the presentation. The idea of a cocktail tree is a little bit different. And in this case, I want to talk about a multi-grafted pear tree. So you can see in that picture in the middle, there's 3 different varieties of Asian pear. And so many trees need a pollinating friend in order to create fruit. So we're probably familiar with this idea of cross-pollination. Some things are self-fertile. For example, peach trees don't need another peach to provide different pollen to cross-pollinate it, but many of the fruit trees that we love do, like pears and apples and pawpaws and persimmons. These are fruits that need a pollinator friend. And in our business, we're finding that a lot of times people only have the space to plant a few fruit trees. And so if you have a space to only plant 2 fruit trees in your yard, well, then you're basically forced to plant 2 of the same type of tree. You're going to have to plant like 2 apples or 2 pears so they can cross-pollinate each other. But if we get 2 different trees that both have several varieties grafted onto them, then they can be self-pollinating trees. And we're finding this to be incredibly important in terms of creating more edible landscape opportunities in our environment. So if you're looking to go out and make all this happen, you want to go create that multi-grafted tree, these are the tools you're going to need. You're going to need a grafting or a budding knife. You're going to need some of that parafilm tape, and you might want to try a grafting tool. Now, those are finicky and don't always work very well, and they're incredibly hard to sharpen. But when they do work, they make grafting really easy. And there's some really neat videos on that. So would encourage you to check out grafting tools. My favorite place to get this stuff is from Fedco. If you go to Fedco's website and type in grafting supplies, you'll see a whole listing of this stuff. And I'm sure all this is on Amazon at this point too. But my go-to source is Fedco. And in terms of where you're going to get this rootstock and scion wood, well, you know, we got all these different places. If you're in a position to take a screenshot or a photo here, or I'm happy to email this presentation to Gateway Greening and help them distribute it. These are places that you can buy rootstock and scion wood. And now remember, the rootstock is that part that you're going to plant in the ground. The scion wood are those cuttings or those pieces of budwood that you're going to be able to graft onto that rootstock. And lastly, I will say, you know, this is one of those things where I usually list some resources and list all kinds of books and pamphlets and things that I think can be really helpful. In this case, I can't say that anything is anywhere near the power of YouTube and going down the YouTube rabbit hole of watching the different grafting techniques and how people do it. And the person who originally taught me how to graft is this guy, Guy Ames. And Guy Ames is an incredible nurseryman and orchardist, and he has produced an awesome video on budding and grafting that you can find on YouTube. This is kind of a screenshot of that, but there's all kinds of great resources there. Video is just so much more helpful, I find, with getting educated on this stuff. And with that said, I wish you all a very bountiful, fruitful, in fact, year. I'm hoping that we can really come together here and create a culture here in St. Louis. And I know I would love to collaborate with folks where we share budwood and scion wood, the cool genetics, and get together and graft and create a culture where we can share and enjoy unique varieties. And the missing piece there is just learning how to graft. But once we do that, sky's the limit in terms of some of the community building and just improved genetics that we can get out there. So thank you all. I'm obviously here to stick around and answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, we do. Yeah, so we've gotten quite a few questions in.
Great.
So a couple people asking questions about the multi-grafted trees. Somebody
Good.
actually, right before you brought it up, asked if you could do several varieties of apples on one tree. And then somebody else also asked what types, if you could kind of go back over which fruits, what trees to like focus on if you're looking at doing that.
If you're looking at doing multi-grafted.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, I think what needs another tree for pollination seems to be kind of where people are getting.
Yeah. Well, as a rule of thumb, I would say almost all the stone fruits are self-fertile, meaning the stone fruits are the peaches, apricots, plums, cherries. All right. So the cool thing about those things is that they're self-fertile. What makes them even cooler is that a lot of them are compatible with different types of fruits. So as we saw in that very first slide, there are certain rootstocks that you can graft on cherries and plums and peaches and almonds all onto one type of rootstock. And the reason that is because certain stone fruit rootstocks are compatible genetically with with all those different species. However, if there's no genetic compatibility, then it doesn't work. You can't take a peach cutting and graft it onto an apple. That doesn't work, right? It's kind of like if you think about skin grafting, you can't take you would never expect a piece of skin to come from a human and go onto a dog. It's just not going to take, because the two pieces of genetics just aren't going to be able to talk to each other.
Great.
So yeah, I'm not sure I finished answering that question. I guess I would say that the place to start with that is all the other trees need pollination friends. So that's like apples and pears and the pawpaws and the persimmons. If there's other specific trees you're interested in, I can mention those too.
And then somebody asked, so they got some 3-foot or more size cuttings from a friend's tree. Is there a recommended length for the wood you graft on? This was asked a little earlier, so they might have covered it. But
yeah, generally a bud stick, what you're going to want to use to graft is a foot long. And the reason for that is because it makes it really easy to put into a plastic bag and store in the fridge. So that's generally why bud sticks are the size that they are in my experience. And then if you're going to take a bud off of any bud stick, well, then you just need that one bud, which is usually like 1 inch long. If you're going to do something like the cleft graft, which is, where you need a whole piece, you can see in the bottom of this picture here, that piece of, 6 inches long, because 4 to 6 inches long, because you want a few buds visible from above that union where you're sticking that piece of scion wood in.
Awesome. Great. All right. Is there, when you're looking at purchasing rootstock, what are you looking at to consider? Like any specific
size is the biggest thing for the most part. So if you want a big tree that's gonna grow really tall and be for your grandkids, you're going to want to look for like a standard size rootstock. A lot of times that means, with apples that you might find, Antonovka, or sometimes Antonovka is the name of a rootstock. Sometimes the standard rootstock is also called seedling rootstock. But what you want to do is mostly find the size that suits the space you're looking for. And so if all you see are names of rootstocks, you're going to want to Google the names of those rootstocks to find the chart. There's charts all over the internet, and it will show how tall that particular rootstock will allow a tree to get. Don't get too bogged down with the rootstock thing. With pears and apples, there are tons of rootstock varieties. However, With other trees, there's no varieties. So it's kind of tricky. Like with pawpaws, there are no rootstock varieties.
Okay, great. Somebody asked, we're starting to get lots of questions, so I'm trying to consolidate them. Can you plant your rootstock in a large pot versus in ground so you don't need to dig it up?
Absolutely.
Okay, there we go, great. Is there any special considerations when you're looking at doing a spalier?
Yeah, dwarfing rootstock. Yep, you gotta get that dwarfing rootstock if you want to do a spalier, or else the tree is going to be exhibiting so much vigor that you're going to spend your days and nights pruning that tree. I would also say that if you're going to espalier, you're going to want to master that bud graft that we saw in the video. And some of these other types of grafting, they're going to make it very challenging for you to create an espalier tree.
And then actually from that, what is the most successful method of grafting and what is your favorite? Somebody.
Well, my favorite and the most successful is that bud graft that we saw the video of. The reason for that is because I think it's really pretty easy. It doesn't take a lot of horticultural skill or tons of practice to be able to be successful. I also think that it maximizes the amount of grafts you can make. So one bud stick that's 1 foot long, it might have 15 buds on it. And that's 15 different trees you can graft with that one bud stick. Whereas if you're using an 8-foot, like in the picture that we can see in the top right, there's this scion wood, let's pretend that's 8 inches long. That's almost your entire bud stick. So then you're using all 15 of those buds just to make one grafted tree. So you don't get nearly as much bang for your buck.
How long can you store those bud sticks before grafting?
1 season. So, bud sticks are taken for the most part in the winter right now in the dormant season. And then you got to use them by pretty much the end of the summer.
So somebody's asking about elderberry. So elderberry rootstock, is it any good for grafting on? Is there anything cool to be able to graft onto it also?
Not that I'm aware of. Elderberry is not a grafted fruit tree. It's just propagated by cutting, and you don't graft it. It's called grown on its own roots, meaning there is no other set of genetics. There's no rootstock in scionwood. It's just the rootstock, and the rootstock is the variety that we want to grow. And I would say that if you have never propagated fruit before, start with an elderberry. It's the easiest to propagate fruit. All you're going to do is wait a few more weeks here in late February and find an elderberry bush or get it from a friend and take a 1 foot or 2 foot even cutting off that elderberry bush and stick it in the ground, and it's likely going to root. That's it.
Great. Do you have any, so somebody's out there they're in St. Louis, any examples of recently grafted trees in St. Louis that they could see in person? I'm trying to think of anything from Gateway Greening, but we don't have anything right now.
Well, so if Gateway Greening is planting orchards, right? And what you're planting at Gateway Greening are newly grafted trees. And with a newly grafted tree, you can almost always very visibly see the graft union. So the graft union on the trees you're buying is usually around 6 inches to a foot off of the ground. And you'll see this bulge and this coming together of 2 different sets of genetic material. And that's one way to see it. Here, custom foodscaping, we usually do it a few tours a year. And we've got different grafting experiments and stuff going on at our place.
Great. Well, actually, we'll be sending an email out after this with like a survey, and it'll be from me, so just respond, because we could actually maybe try to set something up to where maybe we could point out where some new trees were planted. If some people want to see what they look like in person. So, all right, I don't want to keep too long, so I'm trying to find, somebody's asking, so how many buds, I think how many buds are on a graft usually?
It's kind of an unlimited amount, technically. It could just be one bud, like the picture there on the left. You see, there's just one bud. That's all you need, is just a little bit of genetic material from the parent that you're trying to graft from. Or you might have something like the picture in the top right that we saw. Well, that has many buds. In both cases, you're taking a piece of scion wood. In this case, the scion wood is way bigger, but a bud is just another tiny form of scion wood. And so it's generally, you don't want more than, like, I think 4 or 6 buds on the bud stick or on the scion wood, because then there's just too much for that new tree to support. It doesn't want to have to push, it's got to put its energy into making that fusion.
What time we got? I want to make sure we're 5 after. Can we do 2 more questions? How's that sound, Matt?
It's good with me.
Okay. Some people are interested in the gorilla grafting.
Good.
And so a couple of the questions, but really is it like so what does the graft really look like for the gorilla grafting? Is it like the picture where you cut off all the branches down to nubs and then put them in pear trees, into the Bradford, or is it a different type?
Well, you're not limited. I would say in this picture here on the left, in the spring, like where that is a bud that you can go get your bud wood right now, and then on the new growth on the ends of the Bradford pear, where you see that young, newer growth, you're going to make your slit and put your bud graft on it. That's one possibility. Or you can do the other possibility, the one in the top of the screen here, where you can see how the rootstock, it looks like it's straight up and down, like it's close to the ground, right? It doesn't have to be like that. You can do that same exact graft, but the branch might be coming sideways, like the picture in the middle. See that picture in the middle where the branch is coming off at like a 45-degree angle? That branch is graftable as long as you can reach it. So you just simply, let's imagine that you're doing this right as in April, when the tree is kind of leafing out. You're gonna come in there, cut off the end, make a slit, and do that cleft graft on there. So you have options.
Great. And then a couple people asking about graft wax versus using wrap, and also is graft wax a special type of wax?
I don't have experience with the wax. Yep. I'm sure, I believe that the original wax was like beeswax. I could be wrong on that, but yeah, now this paraffin tape is it's incredible technology that makes it really fast and easy to create a really tight seal around your graft. But if you want to go with something more natural, yeah, I'm sure there's wax out there. I don't know about it.
Great. Okay. I know we do have some more Q&A coming in, but we're going to have to cut it short there.